Hello everyone. In this video, we're going to take the exact same goal and approach it in different ways. We're going to start with synchronous code, then we're going to accomplish the same thing with callbacks, then we'll do it with generators, and then we'll add promises to those generators, and we'll explain the benefits and drawbacks as we go. So first of all, let's cover what's actually happening in this program that I'm setting up. We have a data.json file, and all it has is a JSON object with a location property, and the location is a string to the file.text, and file.text has the string hello world with an exclamation mark. And so what we're going to do with our program is we're going to make a request to data.json. We're going to get that location for file.text, and then we're going to print file.text content out to the console. In this case, it's to the terminal in Node.js. And so as you can see, I've already run each version, and we can see that it gives us the exact same result, regardless of which approach we take. So let's get started. First of all, we have our synchronous version. This is fairly straightforward. We're grabbing the file systems module from Node. We have a function called print message, which takes a message and outputs it to the console. That'll be used as our callback to handle the message when we've retrieved it down here. And then we have our function run, which I will keep consistent through most of the examples at least. And all it's going to do is when we call it, we will pass in our callback, which is print message. It'll take that as a parameter and execute the callback function when all of these lines are completed. Now, because this is synchronous, I'm using the file systems read file sync method, which takes a path to a file and an encoding option. So in this case, we're going to read the data.json file. We're going to output the result as a, output the result as a string. So we will be retrieving an object, a JSON object interpreted as a string. So it would be as if you were calling json.stringify on a JSON object. And then because this is synchronous, we can then use location string in the next line. JSON.parse does the opposite of JSON.stringify, so it's going to convert this JSON string into a JSON object. We grab out the location property, which, if you remember, was /file.text, which is this guy here. We're saving that string in location, and then to get our message, we are going to do another synchronous call to that location, which we retrieved from our first call. We're going to interpret it as a string, and then we will pass the response from that into message, save it there, and then pass message into our callback, which prints it to the console, which, as I said, gives us hello world. And just to be clear, I will run node sync again so we can see it happen. And there we go, hello world. And actually, let's just make it perfectly clear. Save that guy, close that. There we go. So we can see that this is happening exactly as I described it. I haven't faked anything here. But this is convenient, right? We know that we're using synchronous calls. But the Node way and the way that you'll have to do a lot of your code is asynchronous. And asynchronous means that as soon as this request starts, something else is waiting for a response, or is going to be providing a response. Our code doesn't wait for that response. It continues on. JavaScript is single-threaded, but it doesn't wait for asynchronous calls to return before it moves on to the next line. So the problem would be if this was asynchronous, then we would get to this line where we need to parse out location string, and it would still be undefined because this wouldn't have returned yet if it was asynchronous. We need some way of letting the program know when we have a value ready to be passed to the next step in our process. And so the most common way to do that, at least before, was with callbacks. So I've renamed it read location just because things get pretty messy pretty quickly with callbacks, but in the other two, you'll see they're just, the main function is just called run. So we call read location, and you'll see that there's no longer read file sync because this is asynchronous. So we call read file. It looks at this path that we pass in, and it's going to interpret it as a string. So exact same as before, but now we need to pass in a callback so that when the data is returned, it gets passed into something. And when you pass something in a callback, it's going to pass that response into whatever callback you provide. I've provided handle response, so we go up here. If there's an error, then it will trigger this block of code, which will throw a new error. Otherwise, it gets passed in as null, and then it gives us a response object. So if we have a response object and no error, then it will parse that JSON string into a data object and then pass data.location into read message, which is essentially a callback for handle response. So then we go to read message, and we will take that location that we got, which is what we get from data.location. We'll pass it into read file, we'll interpret it as a string, and we'll pass in a new callback, which is handle message. So when handle message comes in, if there's an error, it throws an error. Otherwise, it gets a response, and then it passes the response into our next callback, which is print message. Print message is down here. It accepts the message, and it prints it out to the console. Whew. So what that all is nested callbacks. I've written it in a way that makes it look a lot more reasonable. Normally, if you're familiar with nested callbacks, they have the pyramid of doom that looks something like that. It has a bunch of indentation, but this, it's small amounts of code, but even just me reading through that, it was not obvious what was happening. We were jumping back and forth all over the page because that's just the way that callbacks have to work. We have to find some way to let the program know that the data is ready, and one way to do that is with callbacks. But generators allow us to do something absolutely amazing when we have these multiple synchronous calls that need to be done one after another, which is what's happening here. We have a synchronous call, we handle the data, and then we do another synchronous or asynchronous call. Sorry, asynchronous call, get the data back, another asynchronous call. When you have to do that, generators let you write code that does this. Again, all these do the exact same thing, but it looks like this. So let me show you what that is. Right here is our run function, so check that guy out. And if we go back to this, it looks awfully similar. The actually only thing that's different is we've got a couple yield keywords, and this line's not there. So I'm not going to assume you already know generators. I'm going to spend a couple minutes explaining generators. If you are familiar with generators, just skim ahead for another 30 to 90 seconds. So generators, they're a new type of function. And what they provide is a new syntax. So you put an asterisk in there, and that signals to the program, or I should say the JavaScript engine, that you are going to make this function into a generator. And the generator also provides a yield statement, which essentially does three things, or a yield keyword, I should say, which essentially does three things. It signals a spot where the function should wait, the generator should wait. It yields out whatever value follows it, and it can be used as a placeholder for a future value. So when you start up a generator, you execute the function just as you, or you call the function just as you normally would. So run with parentheses, we're passing in the exact same callback we've been using the whole time, which is print message. It gets passed into there, and at the very end, it gets called with the message that we'll be getting. And then we do it.next because generators are iterable. So this creates an iterator. When you execute a generator function, it produces it returns an iterator. So we pass that iterator into the it variable, and then we can call iterator.next, or I should say it.next, and that's going to take us from the start of our generator function to wherever the first key or the first yield keyword is. So we hit this line, and then it goes up to here. And it says, all right, I've got this location variable that I want to declare. What do I want it to assign? What value do I want to assign to it? Oh, yield. All right, so I don't have a value yet. The value is essentially yield. But we're going to yield out this expression right here. fs.read file with looking in the data.json path, interpreted as a string, and we've passed in a callback. So we're very familiar with this line. And so this is going to do exactly what it's done every other time. We go up to handle response. If read file returned an error, then it's going to throw an error. Otherwise, it's going to get a response. And the response is going to be a string, in the JSON string. So it's going to parse it into a data object. It's going to grab the location property off of that object. And instead of returning it or passing it to the next callback, it passes it to it.next. That's the same thing as down here, which means it.next tells the function that it's attached to, the iterator that is attached, the function that iterator is attached to. When you call next on it, it moves from wherever it currently is, which in this case is yield, to the next yield statement or to the end of the function, whichever comes first. So what it also does is it's going to pass in the data.location value. Remember how I said we're waiting for a value to pass into yield? Well, that's what we get from it.next. So let's go through this in order. It's going to pass this out, okay? And then it's going to wait for a response. At that point, we could kind of think of it like this. Let location equal yield. Yield isn't super useful to us. We don't want to call read file yield. We want to call read file and have some sort of string representing a path. So it's waiting. When handle response calls it.next and passes in data.location, that value gets passed in and replaces yield. So it's kind of like this. Go down here, and that's our new value, which in this case is actually a string that looks like if I could type file.text. So that's now what yield is essentially replaced by. So now we have location equals file.text. Because we called it.next, it's going to move to the next line at that point. So that means by the time we've gotten to this line and that we yield this expression out, we now have a value ready for location. So we can pass that into location. So I'm going to just undo everything to go back to where we were, like so. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to say we have a variable called message that we want to declare. We need a value for it. So we're going to assign the value, yield. All right, let's yield out this request with this callback. That callback is going to pass back our response into the yield keyword, which message is then going to be assigned to. So then we have a message with that holds a message variable that holds the value that was returned from the asynchronous call that was passed out. So fs.read file, locations passed in, UTF-8 to interpret it as a string. Handle message is our callback, so it gets passed up here. If it gets an error, then it'll throw a new error. Otherwise, it'll get a response. Passes it.next with response back down to our function. So we have let message equal essentially response, which is the response from this guy here. And then we can very easily, because we iterated to the next yield statement or to the end of the function, it'll run this line, which is callback, with our message that we just got from this response, and we'll output it to the console. And so, as we've seen with every other one so far, node gen, run that, and we get hello world. Excellent. So now, there's one problem with generators. They fix a huge problem, but they leave a problem remaining, which is right now we're using fs.read file. I trust fs.read file. I have no problems with it. But imagine that we're calling a third-party API. And to use Kyle Simpson's example, imagine that it's charging your customer. And you're counting on them doing one response that makes sense and fits with your program. But what if that API doesn't respond once? What if it responds 1,000 times and charges that customer every time? It's a bit of a silly example, but I do like it because it emphasizes the point very clearly. We have basically said, as soon as we pass our callback into this API call, we're saying, here's our callback, call it however many times, however you want, whatever you need to do, just give us a response. And all we're doing is saying, all right, well, if we get that response, then we'll handle it if there's an error. Otherwise, we'll handle it if there's a response. And so that's not an overly safe approach, because if, like I said, something's wrong with their API and they send us the wrong kind of response multiple times, if they send us an error and then a response, there's a whole lot that could go wrong. So what we can do then is we can use promises to get around what's called an inversion of control, where we get to keep the control on what happens with the response when it's made back from the asynchronous call. So what I've created is a very basic knockoff of the fetch API. And so it's just here in fetch module. You can look at it a little more closely if you want, but it essentially does a very basic version of what you're used to doing with fetch in the browser. We can pass into a function called fetch a URL. I've not bothered to do the options because I'm just using that fs.read file, and it's a bit of extra complexity I don't need to handle. And we create a promise that will either be resolved or rejected when the asynchronous call, which is fs.read file, is completed. It takes a URL that you passed into fetch, and which in this case will just be our path to data.json. And it will return it as a string. If there's an error, it'll error. In this case, it's going to say, sorry, bro, it broke, which is very fitting for someone like me. I want to know these nice colloquial messages. And if it gets data, then it will resolve that data, and fetch then returns that promise to you. So it's just like what you're used to using. You get a promise back. And so what you get with promises, here's our run generator down here, and you'll see it looks similar to the last one. It's a little different though. So let's just start from the beginning on what we're doing here. We're calling our generator to produce an iterator, because that's what generators return. We're saving that iterator in the variable it. And we've, as with every time, we've passed in our callback as print message, so that gets passed down to here. Then we call it.next to move from the start of the function to the first yield keyword. I'm going to declare a variable called location, and I want to assign it to the value. Okay, we're going to yield out whatever follows. In this case, we're going to yield out the function getLocation with the arguments of fetch with our path to our data.json, which is the URL that I mentioned from the fetch module, and a callback called iterate. And this is something I've set up just to make it a lot easier to reason about it.next for this particular example, because it allows us to pass it.next around really easily. Iterate just takes a value and then passes that value into it.next. That's all it does. So we're going to pass into getLocation fetch with the URL, which remember returns a promise, which is this guy up here. And we're passing a callback, which gets taken up here. And with promises, you can do a .then to when they are resolved. So if you remember back here, I said I wanted to call resolve if we got data, otherwise we were going to reject it if we got an error. So we're going to resolve the data that we got, otherwise we're going to error and console log out the error. So we get the data. We're going to get the location out of the JSON object, just like we have every other time. Store the location in a variable called location. Then we're going to use the callback that we passed in, which is iterate. So we're going to pass location into iterate, which will pass it into it.next. And that will spin us up into the next line of our generator. So we have message. We're going to declare a variable called message. We're going to assign it to a value. Okay, we need to yield it out before we can get our value. So we're going to do get message, which again takes a promise, which is what we get back from fetch, and we are going to passing our iterator as the callback, or sorry, iterate as the callback. And as we noted before, we have a value already for location because that's what we got back from this call. So we can pass that into fetch. Fetch returns a promise. We do promise.then to handle the data that comes in. Then we're going to use our callback, which is it.next. And that's going to send us to the next line of our code, which executes the callback we originally passed in, which is print message. And that's going to output our message as a console log, which gives us node fetch of hello world with 3 exclamation marks. So that adds some complexity for sure, but here's the benefit. A promise, and I'm still trying to get my head fully wrapped around promises, to be totally honest, but I understand what they are useful for, which is they're a promise for a future, a placeholder for a future value that is only resolved once. And that's the key thing for async functions like this, or async programs. Because if that API that we were talking about before that calls our program 1,000 times, if it calls it 1,000 times, we ignore the 999, because if .then has been called, resolve is done, and this promise is taken care of, and our program does not care anymore. It's essentially like shutting off a listener. If you're used to using the DOM events, we are listening for a resolve event, if you want to think of it that way, and then once that resolve event occurs, we're removing that event listener, and we don't care anymore. Call us as much as you want. So if it errors the first time, then we error out, and we're done. If it sends us back a proper response, then we handle that response, and that's it, we're done. So it gives us that control where we're saying, give us back our, basically they're promising to give us back a value. And then we decide what to do with the, what to do with the value when we get it. And we make decisions on how we want to handle errors and how we want to run the rest of our program. So we have uninverted that inversion of control. Everything happens on our end once again. So it's worth it, I think, to spend some time trying to learn promises. And to be fair, this is a lot lower level than you would normally see with promises and generators, because I didn't want to use any external libraries. So I wrote everything here in pure JavaScript code, if you want to put it that way. I haven't required any modules. I made this little fake fetch API just to make it familiar to you guys. But a lot of times you will have libraries that will provide you with promises and, you know, ways of very easily abstracting out how you can mix generators and asynchronous calls. So I hope that helped. If you are completely new to all this stuff, asynchronous code in general, when you started watching this video, you'll probably want to review it a couple times. And honestly, write out these codes. Like, follow them, play with them, mess with them, get used to callbacks. Just because this is the new way to do it doesn't mean that you should totally ignore callbacks and all the frustrations and breakthroughs that people have had with callbacks. Understand these, because callbacks are still going to be useful to you. And then when you understand callbacks, you'll be able to understand why these are so beneficial when you're working with generators, because it looks synchronous even though it's asynchronous. And finally, if you ever are doing a lot of API calls and maybe you have a bad experience with one, you will see the benefit of using promises to have a much more reliable response chain. So this was not in depth on any of them in particular. This is a general migration from one to the other. I hope that helped. If it did, let me know. If it didn't, also let me know. I'm trying out these YouTube streaming services, and I'm hoping this will make videos a bit more consistent from me, because up to this point, I find that it's the editing that I don't want to spend my time doing. So I'll see you guys in the next video. Hopefully that'll be soon. Thanks. Toodaloo.